Hello and welcome to this game review. In this one we will talk a bit about opening principles and later about statics and dynamics and how to try to get compensation after losing a pawn or two. So it started as the dragon. So this is a possible variation, but here usually people play not e5 but like bishop d3 castles, then try to play e5. After queen d4, now black has a small lead in development as it is him to move and he already has a piece developed. So we could continue fighting for the center, for example d5 or even d6. Best move is probably queen b6, more or less forcing a queen trade and improving the structure. Now black has one very long pawn island, which is a very nice one, and the rook is activated. Instead, black plays this move a5 after some thought, but this is simply a mistake in opening principles. In the opening, we must try to develop the pieces as quickly as possible, and we must play in the center, not moving around pawns for no reason. And even if bishop a6 is an idea, this is definitely not the priority in this position. Black's king is in the center. We must castle as soon as possible. Also, if we can develop with tempo, we should do that. Instead, now black has lost a move on a5, which is not really doing anything for black's position. Now a5, and white gets a small initiative. After, of course, black is still fine, but could have been better. Okay, e6. Maybe it was better to develop like this, because now after e6, this square on d6 is very weak, and if we ever play d5 or d6, the pawn on c6 will also be weak. Okay, this is more or less fine. Queen a4, black plays bishop e7. Maybe the bishop is not very useful here. Black could have improved the queen with tempo. Again, if we can improve pieces with tempo, we should do this. For example, bishop f4, we can develop the bishop, castles. And black is slightly better because he has a little bit more development. The compact pawn center is very nice, and he can play d6 at some point to exchange. And the b and c files will be good for the rooks. Now bishop b7, rook c8. But this, this kind of leaves the pawn on d2, a5 a bit weak, and here we're basically forced to give it up. So bishop c6 is a good idea, trying to trade some bishops. And after queen g5 and castles, black is down a pawn, and he is down in development. But we could take the pawn back, and I'm not sure why we did not take it. Sure, it's a bit scary to move around the queen so much, but as we have started moving around the queen, we should make use of it. And now black is kind of fine if he castles. We could also develop with bishop d6 with tempo. The king could even go to e7 to keep the pawn on d7 protected. And we have a nice rook, a nice queen in the center. Should be doing more or less fine. After bishop e7, f4, now black is a pawn down. So here black fought for a while on this move. So unless we saw something very concrete here, we should take the pawn, as there is nothing white can do for the moment. Everything is defended, and a pawn is a pawn. So a pawn is forever, and now we'll have to suffer. Rook ac1 is played, and black gives a check, and bishop e3, but this doesn't really do anything. Instead, we should probably just castle as soon as possible. Try to play something like rook c5. Maybe now this idea might be a bit more useful. Okay, bishop c5 and the bishop e3. But now after d4, c3, we did not win the pawn on c2. Okay, castles, queen d7. So now we are 2 pawns down. White's pawns are these ones. So they're not really queening yet, but in the long term they will become queens, so we must do something as quickly as possible. At this point we don't really even have time anymore, as both sides have 3 minutes each, so it's kind of a time scramble at this point. But let's see, queen c2, white takes another pawn, probably something like queen g6 is better, kind of setting a small trap that if white takes, rook c2 will attack, checkmate. White's only move is queen b7 to stop this, and black can now take here. This is kind of a weakness, and the white's king is slightly weaker. It's nothing too special, but we can try to play h5, h4 and try to weaken it somehow. So we need dynamics here. With queen c2, white takes another pawn, and black decides to exchange. Well, at this point we only have a minute. The position is more or less lost, but we still got some chances. So now queen b7. So now white is 3 pawns ahead, but this pawn on d4 is not entirely useful as it can't really move anytime soon. And if this pawn falls, then the a pawn will also be weak. So even though we're 3 pawns down, it's not the end of the world. Now rook c2 is played. Maybe we could have done this faster by taking the pawn on b2. But okay, here queen e2 is played. And here we could have already taken back one of the pawns with rook d2. And here we get this position where we are again down 2 pawns, but this passer is not that dangerous, so we can block it quite easily. And this one can't really move, at least it can move right now, but at the end of all this, we must understand that white's second rank is quite weak. So if the rooks ever go to the second rank, they will be quite weak. I mean, quite strong, attacking g2 and h2. Okay, queen e2 makes sense. Rook e1, queen f2. And now white kind of forces the queen exchange, ruining their structure. Now black takes the pawn, and again, we are down 2 pawns, but it's not the end of the world. We can still play. Because we have an active rook, there are many weak pawns. Rook a2, it's good to not exchange rooks. Rook a8, and rook e2 b1. And this was black's biggest chance. Again, checks, captures, and attacks. So black took here, but we can't take here because of checkmate. So black reacted to this quite quickly. But instead, we could have done this small deflection tactic of rook takes a4. And now, even though both rooks are hanging, if white takes one, we will take with check. And this is a draw because white's extra pawn is this one, which is not very useful as d5 will just exchange pawns if white ever does it. And we can just play g6, king g7, and we should never lose this. After this, unfortunately, we are more or less lost because white gets the rook behind his passed pawn, which means we will be very passive. Here king f8 is played, but here in rook endgames, we must blockade the pawn as quickly as possible. And here rook a5 was a must move. The game is still lost, but at least we can fight on by bringing the king as close as possible and then substituting the rook for the king. But now white doesn't push the pawn, so we are going to blockade anyway. And here the position is more or less lost. What we could do is maybe g5, try to exchange some pawns as we're defending, and later try to play rook a8, rook h8 to try to win some pawns on the king side. But of course, there's not that much to do here, and there's not really any time here either. And at this point, white made another passed pawn. So yeah, here black resigned, as it is more or less hopeless. So this was quite a difficult game by black. It would probably have been a lot easier if we hadn't wasted a tempo with a5. And later, the pawn on a5 simply fell as it became easier to attack than to defend, while on a7 it would be kind of fine. So hopefully this was useful. Hopefully you play better in the next dragon and not play these flank moves with pawns.